always believed I knew his every move. After 20 years of marriage, I knew his schedule, his habits, even his silences. But that night, something that seemed simple shattered that certainty. He said he was playing soccer, but his cell phone location showed an unknown apartment at 11 p.m. The little blue dot blinked on the screen, as if daring me to face the truth. My heart raced and my hands sweated as I stared at that screen. It was as if the entire weight of our years together fell on my shoulders at once. The excuse of training with friends sounded flimsy, almost ridiculous. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh at the irony. Inside me, anger mixed with a feeling of emptiness I'd never felt before. And it was in that instant that I realized nothing would be the same from then on. That little lie hid something much bigger, something I wasn't yet ready to see. But with each passing second, the desire to find out turned into a necessity. And I knew there was only one choice: follow the trail to the end. In the early years, I believed we had built something solid. He looked at me as if he were certain I was the right person, and I responded without fear. Our mornings were filled with small rituals, like making coffee together, laughing at the news on TV, and planning the day. Every detail seemed to confirm that love was in the right place. And I never imagined that one day that could change. There was a sweetness in our gestures that made me believe in eternity. When he came home from work, he would drop his backpack on the couch and come straight to hug me, as if that contact were essential. I felt the weight of his exhaustion, but also his desire to be close. They were hugs that gave me security and made me forget any problems. Home smelled of complicity and promise. Our conversations were long, sometimes even banal, but charged with intimacy. We spoke of plans for the future, of trips we still wanted to take, of dreams that seemed small but held immense value to us. A simple dinner at home became an event, because his presence was enough. I felt like I was living the kind of relationship many people strive for. There was pride in telling our story. As the years went by, responsibilities and commitments crept in. Payments, renovations, double workloads, family members asking for support. All of this consumed us, but we still found ways to connect. Sometimes it was a quick text during the day, sometimes a hurried kiss before bed. It wasn't the same intensity as the beginning, but it was enough to keep me confident. I believed this was just real life. But little by little, what seemed like routine began to turn into distance. Conversations no longer held the same lightness, affectionate gestures became rarer. I told myself it was normal that long-term relationships change pace. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, as if something were being lost. And this silent emptiness began to bother me. He became more attached to his cell phone, something that had never been characteristic of him. Before, it would sit forgotten on the table, vibrating inconspicuously. Now it was always nearby, tucked away in his pocket or face down. When I asked, he'd say it was just work. I believed him because I still wanted to trust him. But deep inside me, a doubt began to grow that wouldn't go away. His absences also became more frequent. First, they were meetings that ended late, then casual get-togethers with friends I'd never met. With each new excuse, I convinced myself he had a right to his space. But at the same time, it bothered me that I wasn't included in these parts of his life, as if an entire area had been closed off to me, and the worst part was I silently accepted it. One night in particular stuck with me. He arrived after midnight, claiming the game had gone on for too long. I didn't want to create conflict, so I pretended to be asleep. But the scent on the sheets wasn't his, much less mine. It was something new, sweet, that didn't belong in that house. I turned to my side, took a deep breath, and held back the tears. In that moment, I felt the first real crack in what I believed to be solid. Even with the signs, I insisted on remembering how we were. I clung to the good memories, as if they could override the evidence. I kept telling myself that he was just tired, that nothing was happening, because the idea of betrayal was too painful to face head-on. It was easier to convince myself I was exaggerating. Even though, deep down, my intuition screamed. With friends, he continued to act well. He knew how to laugh out loud. He knew how to tell stories that portrayed our life as perfect. I watched and thought, could it be me who's distorting everything? It was confusing, because in public he seemed the same man as always, but at home, the silences mounted. The contrast was so great it made me question whether I really knew the person I lived with. There were also small, almost imperceptible changes. A new outfit I'd never seen before, a more careful hairdo before going out, a different perfume bought without telling me. Details that could have been normal, but which, combined, drew attention. I saw them but pretended not to. Because admitting it meant questioning the entire life we'd built. I didn't know if I had the strength to do it. Each night alone on the couch, feeling the space beside me empty, the sensation intensified. The silence in the house became unbearable, and I found myself remembering the time when that silence was filled with conversation. I tried to get closer, suggested plans together, talked about short trips. He always had an excuse: work, tiredness, commitments. It was like talking to a wall. And the worst part was, I accepted it. My maturity made me try to rationalize. I thought, relationships change, he must be going through a difficult time. I didn't want to believe there was someone else. That hypothesis seemed too cruel, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was as if a parallel story was happening right before my eyes, and I, lacking courage, watched from afar. The small suspicions began to grow rapidly. A distant look during dinner, a curt answer on the phone, a smile that seemed no longer mine. Nothing explicit, but everything was very clear. It was as if my heart already knew the truth even before any proof. And this silent certainty was worse than any confrontation, because I felt powerless. I tried to talk to him once, calmly. I asked if everything was okay, if there was something he wanted to tell me. He smiled, kissed me on the forehead, and said, "You've been very sensitive, love, everything's fine." The phrase should have reassured me, but it had the opposite effect. I felt treated like a naivete, as if my perceptions were worthless. That's when I realized I was alone in my search for the truth. It was a strange kind of loneliness because he was there physically. We slept in the same bed, shared the same table. But, emotionally, he felt miles away. It was the worst form of absence, the one that happens even with presence. I would lie next to him and feel as if I were next to a stranger. And this feeling began to erode my confidence from the inside out. Even small things like the way he looked at me changed. Before there had been tenderness in his eyes. Now there was a rush, as if he were always somewhere else. I pretended not to notice, but each look wounded me like an invisible cut. It was in these moments that I wondered if I was still desired, if I was still part of his thoughts. Doubt is cruel because it settles in and grows silently. The most painful thing was realizing that life was going on as normal on the outside. Work, bills, family gatherings, everything seemed the same. But inside, a storm was brewing. It was like living two realities, the apparent one, which everyone saw, and the internal one, which only I knew. And this contrast was suffocating because it prevented me from asking for help. Who would believe me without proof? The first cracks were there, but I tried to patch them with old memories. I mentally relived the good times, like someone putting a bandage on an open wound. But the pain didn't lessen. It was only masked for a few moments. I knew deep down that at any moment something would surface. And yet, I clung desperately to what remained of our story. Every time he left, saying he was going to play soccer, I felt a knot in my stomach. Before, that excuse wouldn't have held any weight. It was just leisure. But now, it sounded like a curtain. I stayed home, staring at the clock, trying to believe his words. But every minute that passed felt like a theater. And I wondered how long it would take for the truth to show itself. I began to notice even trivial details, like the way he locked his phone. The password suddenly changed, without explanation. When I asked, he said it was for security, that work required it. I tried to believe him, but I knew it wasn't just that. It was a barrier between us, consciously created. And suddenly, I found myself on the outside of his life. This exclusion slowly consumed me. I was no longer the confidant, the partner I'd always been. I was just the wife at home waiting for crumbs of attention. This realization slowly hurt until it became unbearable. Because it wasn't just about betrayal, it was about being invisible. And I never thought I'd feel this way in my own marriage. I tried to hide it in front of others. I wore ready smiles at family gatherings, laughed at friends' parties. But inside, the anguish silently accompanied me. No one noticed, and maybe it was better that way. I wasn't ready to face reality out loud. because saying it in words meant admitting it completely. The nights became long. I lay and stared at the ceiling, waiting to hear the door open. He'd come in with the same excuse, the same tired smell, but there was something new, an absence in his eyes. I didn't need anything else to understand something was wrong. Even without concrete proof, the feeling was already overwhelming. This process was transforming me. Little by little, I stopped being the confident woman I once was. I became suspicious of even the simplest details. The color of her clothes, the tone of her voice, the length of time she spent in the shower. Anything became suspicious. And I hated seeing myself in that role, but I couldn't help it. It was as if my body was reacting before my mind could. I even began to think it was just my own insecurity, that maybe the problem was within me, not him. This doubt gnawed at me even more as I began to blame myself. But something inside me also knew it wasn't imagination. It was intuition, the kind that never fails, the kind that comes from within. And it was already preparing me for what was about to happen. Over time, I realized that the trust we had faded without me even noticing. What was once naturalness became secret. What was once laughter became silence. And what was once security became fear. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, but by the time you realize it, it's too late. And that's what hit me hard. It was at this point that I realized something bigger was happening. Because deep down, every detail that seemed isolated was part of the same plot. I didn't yet have the puzzle complete, but I could already see the pattern, and it wasn't anything like the life I imagined. I just didn't know where this story would take me. The cruelest thing of all was that it seemed normal. Nothing scandalous, nothing explicit, just subtle signs. And that's exactly what hurts. Betrayal doesn't begin with an explosion, but with small, almost invisible noises. I was already hearing those noises, and I knew they would soon turn into screams impossible to ignore. And when that realization dawned, there was no turning back. I knew I was entering a territory of no return, where each discovery would hurt, but also liberate. And even without wanting to, I was ready to go through with it. Because the truth, however harsh, was already knocking on the door. I remember exactly the first time doubt became something real. We were at home, he on the couch, phone in hand, and I in the kitchen, finishing dinner. The sound of a notification reached me, and I saw the quick, nervous way he turned the screen down. It wasn't a natural movement. It was a reflex of someone who didn't want to be seen. It was then that a chill ran down my spine. That night I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself it could be a work message, perhaps some annoying colleague insisting after hours, but something about his manner resonated with me. It wasn't the content I hadn't seen, but the exaggerated care taken to conceal it. The silence that followed that gesture seemed louder than any explanation. And even without proof, I knew something wasn't right. I began to notice patterns. His cell phone was no longer left lying on the table like before. He'd go to the bathroom with it, even take it with him to hang clothes on the line. It was as if it were a secret that needed to be kept in plain sight at all times. And each time I noticed this care, my heart sank deeper. It wasn't just habit, it was protection. Dinner conversations changed too. Before, he'd share details about work, his colleagues' jokes, even the traffic on the way. Now, his answers were short. Normal, easy, nothing major. It was as if he were afraid to say too much. As if the words that didn't come out carried a weight I couldn't yet identify. But I already understood there were secrets between us. One late afternoon marked my body like a scar. He left saying he was going to play soccer with his friends. So far, nothing major, it was routine. But when he opened his backpack to get a shirt, I noticed a strong perfume that wasn't mine. That scent lingered in the air like a silent betrayal. He laughed and said it was new deodorant, but I knew better. And that certainty gnawed at me. My first impulse was to confront him, but I held back. I decided to observe, to record every detail because I needed to have more than just a suspicion. I began to notice how much time he spent away, the hours that previously hadn't stretched out and now dragged on. I began to notice the days he'd come out overdressed for a simple game, and every detail added together became evidence in my mind. There was also the Uber incident. He'd forgotten to delete an email receipt, and I saw the final address of the ride. It wasn't the soccer field, nor the house of any known friend. It was a building in a neighborhood we never frequented. The time was almost midnight, and the excuse about playing soccer no longer held water. I remained silent, but that information stuck with me like a fire. The silence gradually transformed into covert surveillance. Not obsessive, but attentive. I began to notice the way he arrived, the smell of alcohol he claimed not to have had, the quickly changed shirt, the way he avoided my gaze. Small signs anyone could notice, but only those who experienced it firsthand can understand. It was the sum of the details that formed the truth. Still, he maintained his facade. He'd sit on the couch, turn on the TV, and make some silly comment to appear natural. But the naturalness had already faded. Because I saw his eyes glued to his phone waiting for something, chuckling to himself every now and then. And when I asked him, he answered too quickly, with memorized phrases. This excessive caution was the biggest giveaway. One morning, I woke up and found him nowhere to be found. I went to the living room and saw the light from his phone illuminating his face. He was typing, with a discreet smile, as if exchanging confidences. When he saw me, he got scared, turned off the screen, and said it was work stuff. Work at 3 a.m? No need to say anything else. I already knew I was living on a stage. Little by little, I began to accept that my intuition wasn't paranoia. The signs were clear, even if he tried to hide it. The way he looked away, the way he changed the subject when I approached. The body speaks, even when the mouth lies. And I learned to listen to his body, which screamed louder and louder about the hidden betrayal. One night, he left his smartwatch on the table. I never intended to touch it, but the device vibrated with a notification. It was from a messaging app, and the name that appeared wasn't anyone I knew. He quickly picked it up, almost tripping, and said it was from work. But the tone of his voice and the haste were more revealing than any read message. I wasn't sleeping like I used to. My thoughts raced in circles, trying to understand when everything had changed. I could no longer find peace in the gestures that once comforted me. Because now every smile seemed staged, every departure from the house felt like a secret chapter. I was living life as usual, but under a roof full of lies. And it was in this scenario that I began to store every little piece of evidence within myself. I didn't say anything, I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I simply mentally recorded every sign, every slip-up. I knew I would need to piece it together because betrayal doesn't reveal itself all at once. It hides in the details, and I'd already had more than enough to understand that my world was crumbling. He tried to turn the situation around, as if I were to blame. He'd say things like, "You're too suspicious, you're seeing things where they don't exist." The classic game of inverting reality, of making me believe I was exaggerating. But I wasn't the same as before. I didn't accept it so easily. Maturity gave me clarity, and I knew it wasn't an illusion. One day, while folding clothes, I found a receipt in my pants pocket. It wasn't from a bar, nor from a well-known restaurant. It was from a cafe in a distant neighborhood, at a time he swore he was working. I held that paper like a piece of evidence. I didn't confront him, just kept it. Because now I was certain, there was another life happening out of sight. The excuses were so repeated that they lost credibility. He would say the same phrases, as if rehearsed: traffic, meeting, friends. I listened, but I no longer believed him. Because each justification was accompanied by a detail that contradicted everything. It was impossible to ignore. And each poorly told lie was another brick in the wall that separated us. It was in this process that I realized how betrayal reveals itself. Not in scandalous scenes, but in everyday gestures. A turned screen, a strange perfume, a hidden message. Nothing spectacular, all mundane. And that's precisely what hurts the most, because it could happen to anyone. It wasn't a movie script. It was real life slipping through my fingers. I still didn't have all the answers, but there were no longer any doubts. The first sign had become a silent certainty. What had once been merely intuition was now surrounded by subtle proof. And with each new detail my pain grew, but so did my strength. Because I knew that sooner or later the truth would be revealed in its entirety. Anguish accompanied me every moment. Working, cooking, talking with friends. It all felt like poorly rehearsed theater. I smiled, but inside I was on high alert. My heart beat faster with every notification he received, with every unexpected departure. It was like living under constant tension, waiting for the next sign, and I knew it would come. The following days were a mixture of silence and vigilance. I became increasingly attentive without him realizing it. He thought he was deceiving me, but I could already see beyond that, and with each new detail the picture became complete. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was a fact in the making. At that moment, the pain was still contained, but deep. It was like living next to a stranger I still called my husband. His every gesture felt rehearsed, every word a disguise. I didn't know how long I could maintain my silence. But I was determined. I would only speak when I was absolutely certain, with no room for excuses. It was in this state of alert that I realized something even more disturbing. It wasn't just about infidelity. It was about manipulation. He wanted me to believe I was wrong, that my mind was deceiving me. This attempt to invert reality was cruel, but it was also what gave me strength. Because if he tried so hard to hide it, it was because there was so much to reveal. The first sign had already become a collection of clues, each one clearer, more weighty, more impossible to ignore. I no longer needed to guess. I needed only the final confirmation. And deep inside, I knew it was near. The truth doesn't hide forever. It always finds a way to reveal itself, no matter how stifled. And I was ready to face it, even if it hurt. Because I had reached a point where doubt hurt more than any answer. And it was at that point that I realized the storm was about to explode. I didn't know when or how, but I knew I would soon have definitive proof. Something that would leave no room for excuses, for well-told lies. Something that would expose everything he'd been hiding. And that certainty kept me going. Because when the truth comes, there's no escaping it. He began to notice that I was more attentive. Whenever I asked a simple question, like "Where have you been?" the answer came quickly, too firmly, as if it had been rehearsed. His tone carried an impatience that hadn't existed before. And with each answer, I felt his attempt to turn things around. It wasn't just an explanation. It was a preemptive defense. One night, I sat next to him on the couch and shared my concerns. I wasn't accusatory. I simply said I felt him distant. He laughed, that mocking laugh, and said, "You've been seeing problems where there aren't any." That phrase echoed in my mind like a clear attempt to disarm me. There was no affection, just an effort to make me believe the fault was mine. From then on, this pattern repeated itself countless times. I'd ask something simple and he'd respond with an exaggerated tone. "It's just soccer, you're getting paranoid." Or even, "You need to trust me more, I can't be watched all the time." Words that seemed ready to blame me, never to calm me. It was as if my intuition were a disease, not a warning. I remember a brief argument in the kitchen. I questioned why he never let go of his cell phone. Instead of explaining, he slammed the cabinet door and said, "What's this obsession? You need therapy." I remained silent, not for his reason, but for the weight of the psychological violence. Turning the victim into the guilty party was the perfect strategy, and I fell for it, because I still loved him. In everyday conversations, his expressions changed. When I spoke about something that bothered me, his look was contemptuous, as if I were dealing with a sullen child. "You're better than this. You can't imagine such nonsense," he'd say. But it wasn't encouragement. It was manipulation. I felt like I was being pitted against myself, and it slowly undermined my confidence. Once, I asked about a ride-hailing app I'd found in his email. The destination had nothing to do with anything he'd told me. He looked at me seriously and replied, "You go through my things? Don't you trust me?" The question didn't answer mine, but it did put me in the dock. And for a few seconds, I almost believed I was in the wrong. That was the power of gaslighting. He also used comparisons to weaken me. "You're so different. You're not the calm woman I once knew." Words that sounded like criticism but had another purpose, to make me doubt my sanity. I listened, took a deep breath, and pushed my discomfort aside. Because deep down I knew the change wasn't in me, but in him. At family gatherings he insisted on acting normal. He laughed loudly, hugged, and told jokes. And if I seemed quiet, he'd whisper in my ear, "See? No one notices anything, only you with those ideas." This comment hurt me more than any silence. Because it wasn't just hidden betrayal, it was exposed manipulation, even if hushed. I had become, without realizing it, the culprit in the story he was writing. The suspicion was all in my head, the sadness was drama, the distance was lack of trust. And the more I listened, the more I felt my strength draining. It was like being trapped in a reality that made no sense, but which he repeated until it seemed true. This is the essence of denial, eroding the victim's logic. There was one night when I tried to be more assertive. I asked directly, "Is there someone?" He didn't hesitate, let out an ironic laugh, and said, "Are you crazy?" The answer didn't convince me, but the coldness with which it was delivered chilled me to the core. Because there was no fear of losing, only contempt. And that was more revealing than any confession. Over time, I understood that his responses weren't meant to calm me. They served to confuse me, weaken me, destabilize me. It was a psychological game, where with every move I was pushed against the wall. He knew what he was doing, knew how to play with my emotions. And I felt increasingly isolated, unsure of who to trust. His expressions were calculated. If I cried, he'd say, "You're overreacting again, go calm down and see it's nothing." If I remained silent, I heard, "See, I can't talk to you." Any reaction I made became an argument against me. No matter what I said, he already had his answer ready. And the result was always the same. I felt inferior. What hurt most was realizing this was happening subtly. There was no constant yelling, no physical aggression. It was with ordinary words in low tones that he undermined my certainty. And this subtlety made it seem less serious than it actually was. But anyone who's experienced it knows. These small manipulations destroy more than blatant explosions. At times, I even doubted my intuition. I spent hours wondering if I was truly seeing things where they didn't exist. I tried to convince myself he was still the man from the early years. I clung to the good memories like someone holding onto a rope in free fall. But even so, the emptiness wouldn't disappear. It was impossible to hide the truth with a sieve. Time passed and I saw the pattern clearly. Whenever the lie was about to be exposed, a blunt response came, an attempt to turn the tables. "You don't trust me, but I never gave you a reason." This phrase was repeated so often that it almost became a catchphrase. And I just kept thinking, if you never gave me a reason, why do I need to ask so many questions? The cruelest thing was that after each denial, he would return to his normal behavior. He would sit next to me, turn on the TV, and comment on the soap opera, as if nothing had happened. I looked at him and felt a mixture of anger and helplessness. Because this normality was a pretense, a facade, and I could no longer believe any gesture. Sometimes he would even try to turn the situation into affection. After a fight, he would come and hug me and say, "You know you're the woman of my life, don't you?" And I would remain silent, swallowing the contradiction. Because the words were sweet, but the actions were bitter. It was like living in two opposing realities, unsure which was true. This manipulation wasn't constant, but frequent enough to wear me down. I found myself increasingly tired, without the strength to argue. Because every conversation turned into a trap, every question into an accusation against me. It was like fighting an invisible enemy, always one step ahead. And this silent war consumed me from within. I realized that denial wasn't just a tactic, but a planned strategy. He didn't just want to hide. He wanted to make me give up looking. If I believed he was exaggerating, there would be no confrontation. If I believed he was paranoid, there would be no proof. And that was exactly what he wanted, to turn me into an unwitting accomplice to his silence. In moments of greater fragility, I even considered apologizing. Apologizing for suspecting, for feeling, for observing. But deep down, something inside me rebelled. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't making it up. The signs were there, even if he tried to hide them, and this silent revolt was the only flame that kept me going. The nights became an internal battlefield. I lay in bed next to him, but I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about every sentence, every look, every disguised lie. The darkness of the room was the perfect setting for my doubts to echo. And in the silence, I decided I wouldn't stop, because my intuition was stronger than its game. He didn't realize it, but with each gaslighting, each denial, I became more awake. Before, I was still hesitant. Now, I was clear that I was being manipulated. The difference is that I no longer showed my reaction. I learned to smile, to pretend to believe, while inside I collected evidence. His game was no longer enough to blind me. It was too painful to see how someone I loved could be so cruel in a calculated way. But at the same time, it was this shock that made me wake up. I could no longer be the woman who accepted shallow excuses. The maturity I had achieved did not allow me to live in illusion. I needed to face it, no matter how difficult it was. With each lie, my anger silently grew. It was not explosive, it was contained, strategic. I didn't want to argue anymore, I wanted to observe. Because I knew that sooner or later the truth would come out in a way he couldn't deny. And that thought gave me strength to endure the long nights. I knew there was still a lot to come. The lies were no longer sustainable, and the mistakes became more and more frequent. It was like a castle about to collapse, held together only by empty words. And when the structure collapsed, I would be ready to see what was really hiding behind it. And it was precisely this silent waiting that led me to the next step, the careful investigation, carried out in details that he never imagined I would observe. I've never been the type to touch anyone's cell phone. I always believed that respect was the basis of any relationship. But after so many denials and crossed responses, my perception changed. I wasn't looking for gossip, I was looking for clarity. And that's how I started paying attention to details that would previously have gone unnoticed. The first thing I noticed were the smells. He came home with perfumes that weren't ours. It wasn't my moisturizer, nor his deodorant. It was something sweet, striking, that had no connection with our routine. I took a deep breath and tried to believe that it could be from the environment, the car, anything. But deep down I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Then came the clothes. Shirts came back from the street with different folds, as if they had been taken off and put back on the body. On one of them I found a light, almost imperceptible lipstick stain. It wasn't red, it was a light shade, but enough to chill my body. He said it could have been from a coworker's hug. I smiled on the outside, but inside I kept the proof. I also started to observe the schedules. Before, he always had a pattern. He would leave at a certain time, return within a predictable window. Now everything was unstable. One day he said he had a late meeting, the next he ended up at a friend's house. But there were never any photos, no mentions, nothing to confirm these versions. They were just words in the air. One afternoon I received an Uber receipt in my email that he forgot to delete. The final destination was a building in a distant neighborhood, at 11 at night. On the day he swore he was at a football game. I read and reread that address several times. I could have questioned it at the time, but I didn't want to. I understood that silence, at that moment, gave me more power. The apps also delivered clues. I noticed that he had created a new email used for some online purchases. I saw notifications from restaurants we'd never visited, from takeaways in regions that didn't make sense. Everything discreet, nothing blatant, but enough to feed my certainty. And each detail was another piece of the puzzle that I put together in silence. Even the car became a character in the story. One day, I noticed that the passenger seat was always pushed back, as if someone else had gotten in. The glove compartment contained receipts for tolls on roads he never mentioned. When I casually asked him about the route, he didn't talk. I registered mentally and remained silent, increasingly determined to wait for the right time. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs came in cascades. He would come home in a different mood, laughing to himself like someone reliving moments. Other times he would enter silently, dryly, like someone afraid of slipping into words. This oscillation was new, it didn't suit him, and I, in silence, noted each change like an invisible witness. I even started to notice the details of his body. He arrived with discreet marks on his neck which he said were allergies, a scratch on the arm which he explained as hitting the car door. I didn't argue anymore, I just observed, 'cause it was no longer a question of believing or not, but of understanding how far he would go with his lies. And that gave me more clarity than any hasty confrontation. On one occasion, I noticed that the smartwatch marked physical activities at strange times. Night runs in different neighborhoods, steps counted inside buildings we didn't know. I didn't need to be an investigator to join the dots. The technology he trusted so much was starting to work against him, and I just let it happen, patient. Silence became my ally. He thought he was fooling me, that I believed every excuse, but I had already changed my stance. He responded naturally, pretended not to notice, but inside he was firm. It was a game of patience, and I knew that victory would be in having evidence that he couldn't deny. My silence was louder than any scream. The messages also started to catch my attention. It didn't let notifications appear on the screen. Everything was disabled. But in an oversight, I saw the name Love flashing quickly before he blocked it. It wasn't me. We never used that type of nickname in messages. It was someone else. That silent confirmation burned itself into my memory like fire. Even the credit card brought answers. One day, I noticed a launch in an expensive restaurant on a Tuesday night. He came home that day saying he had eaten pizza with his colleagues. The stories didn't add up. The invoice talked about wine and dessert, not beer and pizza. I held that piece of data as proof, without saying anything. His body betrayed more than his words. He returned with clothes ironed with more care than usual, as if he wanted to impress someone. The shirt smelled like women's perfume, but he swore it was from the work environment. I just kept the details in mind, knowing that sooner or later he would trip over his own act. The biggest change was in the way I looked at myself. Before, when I spoke, there was a tension, connection. Now there was a rush, almost discomfort. I could be telling him anything. He seemed distant, with his mind somewhere else. This absence was more painful than any lie. 'Cause I didn't need concrete proof to know that it was no longer a priority. I began to realize that he treated me like someone who no longer needed to be won over. Meanwhile, he dedicated his best to someone else. The clothes, the care, the spontaneous smiles were no longer mine. I was the stable part, the routine, while outside he was looking for something new. This realization hurt, but it also made me stronger. I never thought I would do this, but I started taking photos of the little tests. A receipt, a blinking message, a strange address. It wasn't revenge, it was self-protection. I needed to have at hand everything he was trying to hide. Because I knew that when the time came, only facts would speak louder than excuses. Work trips also entered the radar. Before he would return with small souvenirs, a t-shirt, a local sweet. Now, he didn't bring anything. And the connections on these trips were quick, full of haste. It was as if he was always in another place, without time even for a simple, "I miss you." This absence became more revealing than any words. Through it all, I still struggled with the urge to believe him. There were times when I convinced myself that I might be overreacting. But one new detail was enough to emerge for that hope to die. It was like living on a pendulum between denial and certainty. Until certainty began to weigh more than any illusion. There was a day when he said he would stay late in a meeting. I decided not to comment, but I noted the time it came out. Later, I saw on the bank statement an expense at a bar at the same time. There was no meeting. This shock made me lose sleep, but it also gave me strength, because now I had something tangible, not just sensations. My routine began to revolve around this silent investigation. I continued working, taking care of the house, meeting friends, but in the background, I observed every detail of him. I was no longer lost in doubts, I was collecting evidence. And that gave me the feeling that, finally, I was regaining control of the situation. The nights were the hardest. Lying next to him, I remembered every detail discovered. It was like watching a movie in slow motion, putting together scenes that only made sense at the end. I knew I was about to discover something big. And at the same time, I was afraid of the pain that would come with the truth. He thought he had complete command of the narrative. But I didn't realize that, while I was calling myself paranoid, I was already one step ahead. My silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy, and that made me stronger every day. Because I knew that patience would be my greatest ally. The investigation was not made up of scandals, but of common observations, a receipt, a smell, a look, a time. Things that anyone could see if they were paying attention. I didn't need to be an expert, I just needed to be present. And being present was what opened my eyes once and for all. The most ironic thing is that he seemed comfortable lying. The more I remained silent, the more confident he became. I thought I had given up on my suspicions. But what he didn't know was that my silence was the biggest proof that I was seeing everything, and seeing everything hurt, but it also made me stronger. This process made me understand that betrayal never starts with a big act. It is born in details, in small lies, in hidden gestures. And when you open your eyes, you realize it was there all along. I no longer needed intuition, I had facts. and the facts were crueler than any imagination. Every day the weight of the truth became clearer. I could no longer deny what was before me. The pieces were almost all in place, only the final flag was missing. And I knew that moment was approaching. And when that day came, there would be no more excuses possible. There would be no more room for gaslighting, for ready-made phrases. It would be the clash of reality against the mask he wore every day. And this shock would change everything. Confirmation did not come with screams, nor with movie scenes. It came in a simple, almost banal way, but strong enough to break any doubt. I was at home, going through the bills, when I noticed a card notification at a restaurant we had never been to. It was almost midnight, on an ordinary weekday. The detail was small, but impossible to justify. I decided not to say anything at that moment. I took a deep breath, saved the information, and let him continue to believe that I didn't understand. The next day, he arrived tired, saying he had stayed in a meeting until late. I listened to him calmly, observing his gestures. The lie came out easily, but my heart no longer believed anything. I had one more piece on hand. The final straw came on a Friday night. He said he was going to meet his colleagues to watch a game. I took out my cell phone and discreetly opened the location he never remembered to turn off. The blue dot was not in any bar, nor on a football field. It was in front of a residential building, in a distant neighborhood. I felt my body freeze. My instinct was to get in the car and drive there. The streets were quiet, and I parked with my hands shaking. I watched from afar, like someone looking at a scene they didn't want to see. The lights in the apartment were on, and through the window you could see silhouettes. He was inside, laughing, holding a glass of wine. Next to him, a woman. I didn't need anything else. That image went through my chest like a knife. It was simple, without drama, but definitive. The man who swore he was in football was somewhere else, living another life. I didn't knock on the door, I didn't call, I didn't scream. I just stood there, absorbing the scene, because sometimes silence is stronger than any confrontation. I returned to the car with a heavy heart. I turned on the radio, but I couldn't hear anything. The city continued its routine, cars passing by, people laughing on the sidewalks. And I was there, with the most painful certainty of my life. It was no longer intuition, it was no longer signs. It was the truth laid bare before my eyes. When he came home that night, he acted as he always did. He came in smiling, saying that the game had been really good. I stared at him in silence, and for the first time I was able to control my emotions. He didn't understand, but I already knew. And keeping this secret gave me a strange, almost cold power, because I had the truth and he only had lies. The following days were even more revealing. He repeated his excuses, created new stories, as if he were comfortable inside the theater. But all I could remember was the image of him in the window holding that glass of wine. Every gesture repeated at home seemed like a caricature, and I wondered how far he would be able to take this act. One morning, I noticed another detail that left no room for doubt. In the trash, there was an invoice from a hotel in the region. The time coincided with one of the nights he swore he was in a meeting. I kept the paper, folded carefully, as if it were a silent weapon. There was nothing more that could be said. The evidence was before me. I didn't need to scream or expose at that moment. I learned that calm could be more devastating than an explosion. He believed he was safe within the lie, but with each piece of evidence that emerged, the net tightened more. I just waited. Because the confirmation had already been made, and I knew that sooner or later the moment would come when he would have no way of escaping. I remember a specific dinner. We were at the table, and he was talking about work. Suddenly, his cell phone vibrated, and a quick message appeared before he blocked it. The name was Love. I stared, but said nothing. He just smiled as if he hadn't seen it. His expression changed for a second, and I understood. He knew he had failed. It was at that moment that I realized something important. It wasn't just physical betrayal, it was the double life he chose to build. A life of excuses, hidden messages, silent encounters. And I, on the other side, watching as a witness to a poorly rehearsed play. It was painful, but it also made me stronger. Because now I had clarity. The nights became long, but different. I was no longer lost in doubts. I kept imagining how I would use each piece of evidence I had in my hands. It wasn't about revenge, it was about emotional justice. He had destroyed our trust, and I knew I would have to pay the price. I just needed to choose the form and the moment. The hardest part was maintaining my posture in front of him. Wake up, prepare coffee, talk normally. All this while, the window scene came back to me like a movie. I took a deep breath and remembered, silence was now a strategy. My every gesture was calculated. He didn't realize it, but I wasn't the same woman anymore. At times, I almost escaped my calm. I almost threw everything I saw in his face. But I restrained myself, because I knew it would be hasty. I didn't just want to fight. I wanted the truth to come out in an indisputable way. And inside, I knew that time was working in my favor. The cell phone was once again an accomplice in my process. He left the device on the table and went to take a shower. It vibrated with the notification, and I saw the name of the same woman from the night outside the window. I didn't need to open it to know. That illuminated screen said more than any confession. The proof was there, wide open, and I didn't need to make an effort to see it. Another night, while he was sleeping, I heard an audio that arrived. It was the female voice, laughing softly, saying, "It was amazing today." My entire body shook. I could have lost ground, but instead I took a deep breath. I saved the information and turned off the sound. The shock gnawed at me inside, but it also brought me strength that I didn't know I had. The evidence accumulated in silence. A location on your cell phone, an invoice, a perfume, a message. All common, all plausible, but impossible to ignore when seen together. It was real life, not a scene from a soap opera. And maybe that's why it hurt so much, because anyone could go through that without realizing it. I started looking at myself in the mirror in a different way. Not as the deceived woman, but as the woman who now had clarity. I was no longer a hostage to the lie. I was a witness to the truth. And that changed everything. He believed he had control, but now I was the one in control. And that awareness was my weapon. What struck me most was how he underestimated my perception. I thought it was enough to smile, hug, say a nice phrase, and I would forget. But the images, the smells, the papers, everything was recorded in me. I was no longer the same. And the more he tried to sustain the lie, the more I grew stronger in silence. One Sunday, as we returned from a family lunch, he received a strange call. He answered too quickly, with a soft tone that he never used with me. He got out of the car and spoke quietly, walking from side to side. I stared out the window without reacting. I no longer needed anything else. This was living confirmation that I was right all along. The silence became the greatest weight for him, because the more I remained silent, the more nervous he became. He began to observe me differently, as if he were afraid that I would know. And it was exactly this fear that gave me strength, because he had no idea how much I had already seen. I no longer felt deceived, but ready. Ready to decide what she would do with all that. Confirmation had come in many forms, and there was no more room for excuses. He could try to deny it, but I had enough to dismantle any narrative. And that power changed everything inside me. The sleepless nights were different now. I didn't cry anymore, I just planned. I imagined the right moment, the right shape, the right impact. I didn't want impulsive revenge, I wanted something bigger. Something that showed him that nothing would stay hidden forever. With each repeated lie, I felt his downfall approaching. It was like watching someone walking a tightrope, thinking they are safe. He didn't realize that each movement only brought him closer to the abyss. And I just waited patiently for the moment when he would fall on his own, and that moment was closer than he imagined. Because no matter how much someone tries to hide it, the truth always finds a way to come out. And when it appears, it destroys not only the lie, but all the trust that existed. I had already seen it, I had already heard it, I had already felt it. The confirmation was no longer in doubt, it was before me in every detail. And with that, my stance changed. I was no longer the woman who suspected, I was the woman who knew, and this difference was decisive. Every time I looked at him, I saw not the usual husband but the man who deceived me. The duality was wide open, and I could no longer pretend. And this clarity made me realize that the next stage was inevitable, because, after confirmation, there was only one way: reaction. That night, after seeing him smiling on the phone with someone else, I went into the room and closed the door. I didn't cry right away. I sat on the bed and stared into space, feeling my entire body shaking. The silence was deafening, and I realized I was facing the greatest pain of my life. But at the same time, a strange calm began to emerge. It was as if something inside me had broken, but instead of tearing me apart, it reorganized me. I was no longer the same woman I was before. Naivety was left behind. The shock still burned, but there was also a new strength emerging. A strength that came not from hate, but from clarity. His heart was beating fast, as if it wanted to come out of his chest. I breathed deeply, trying not to let my anger overwhelm me. Because he knew that an explosion at that moment would only serve to give him more weapons. No, I wouldn't lose control. If he chose to live in lies, I would choose lucidity. And that decision gave me a strange feeling of power. I looked at the walls of our house and felt a mixture of pain and anger. Every smiling photo, every framed memory seemed to mock me. It was like living in a museum of illusions. Everything I believed to be true was now a facade. And with each detail my chest tightened, but my mind became firmer. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The pillow felt heavy, loaded with thoughts. I turned from side to side, remembering all the nights I trusted blindly. And I realized that the betrayal wasn't just physical. It was emotional, it was spiritual. It was the theft of trust, the greatest value that someone can give to another. The next day I woke up different. He behaved as if nothing had happened. He smiled, made jokes, talked about work. I watched him in silence, like someone watching a poorly rehearsed play. His every gesture was a confirmation of everything I already knew. And this certainty gave me the peace of mind that I no longer needed to doubt. I started looking at myself differently. Not as the woman deceived, but as the woman who had found out. I knew the truth, and that changed everything. I no longer felt small in the face of his lies. On the contrary, I felt bigger, because I was seeing what he was trying to hide. This clarity was painful but freeing. Inside, a battle raged every minute. Part of me wanted to confront, throw everything on the table, see the mask fall. But another part knew it was early, that it needed to observe more. Anger pushed me towards confrontation, but strategy pulled me towards calm, and I knew that, this time, I needed to think more than feel. I began to realize the difference between what I wanted and what I needed. I wanted to scream, but I had to hold back. I wanted to cry, but I needed to show firmness. Because every tear before him would be used against me, and I was no longer willing to give him that advantage. The tables had turned, and I was the one holding the cards. In intimacy, my body reacted with physical symptoms. My stomach turned, my breathing quickened, my heart raced. I lived as if I was on alert all the time, but, on the outside, he maintained a calm expression. This duality was exhausting, but necessary. Because I knew that victory lay in not giving in to my emotions. In trivial conversations, I tested my calm. He talked about the day. I responded naturally. He made excuses. I just nodded. Inside I knew everything, but I didn't show it. And every time I managed to maintain this posture, I felt stronger. It was like training the mind to resist pain. Nights continued to be my biggest challenge. I would lie down and remember the scene of him at the window, the audio I heard, the invoices. Everything repeated itself like a looping movie. But instead of consuming myself, I started using these memories as fuel. They reminded me that I wasn't crazy, that I was right. And that gave me energy to resist. The anger, when it appeared, didn't come in bursts but in silent waves. I felt it like fire running through my veins. But I learned to turn that fire into focus. Each time the anger arose, I said to myself, wait, the right moment will come. And this emotional discipline became my greatest weapon. Even banal moments took on another meaning. A coffee on the table, a Sunday lunch, a quick conversation. Everything seemed like an act for him and a test for me. And I passed each test because I didn't let my conscience slip. I was no longer deceived. I was observant, and that changed everything. At certain moments, sadness invaded me with force. I looked at him and remembered who he once was to me. I remembered the beginning, the promises, the dreams we built. And that memory hurt like a knife. But soon after, clarity came. That person no longer existed. The man before me was someone else, and I needed to face that. My body asked for tears, but my mind demanded firmness. I cried hidden in the shower so as not to show weakness. He washed his face, took a deep breath, and left as if nothing had happened. This performance was painful, but necessary. Because the battle I was fighting was not just against him, but against my own emotions. At times, I thought about talking to someone. A friend, a sister, someone you trust. But I kept quiet. I didn't want to listen to advice. I didn't want pity. This was mine, and I needed to digest it alone. This choice gave me more strength, because by carrying the secret with me, I also carried control of the narrative. With each new signal, I no longer reacted with shock. It just internally confirmed what I already knew. He was trapped in his own lies, and I just watched. This stance transformed me. I went from victim to strategist without him noticing. And that gave me the strange feeling of being one step ahead. The most curious thing is that he started to notice something different about me. He asked if I was strange, if there was something wrong. I smiled and said everything was fine. And that smile, which hid so much, seemed to make him even more insecure. He didn't know that the truth was already in my hands, and that fear that I saw in his eyes was my greatest silent revenge. I also started to reflect on myself, about how I got there, about how I let myself be fooled for so long. But I didn't blame myself. I understood that trust was not a mistake, it was a choice. He was the one who made a mistake, wasting the trust he received. And this awareness freed me from the guilt that was trying to settle in. With each passing day, I felt more prepared. What was once shock was now clarity. What was once pain was now fuel. I was ready to face whatever came. But I wanted it to be in my time, in my way. And this patience strengthened me even more. In silence, I began to plan mentally, not about how to expose, but about how to not let myself fall. I planned my reactions, my words, my limits, because I knew the confrontation would come and I needed to be ready. I didn't want to be caught off guard, I wanted to be in control. My heart still hurt, but it no longer dominated me. Now, he was just a reminder of what I needed to overcome. I knew the anger and sadness would pass, but the clarity would remain. And it was this clarity that I took with me in every decision. I started to see myself differently in the mirror, no longer as a deceived woman, but as a woman in the process of liberation. Every dark circle, every mark of insomnia was proof of resistance, and somehow that filled me with pride. Because I was still standing. This internal resistance gave me a new attitude. I no longer expected anything from him that could comfort me. I learned to find within myself the strength that he would never give me, and this learning made me even more mature, because now I knew it was up to me. Even in the face of so much pain, I noticed something different. I was becoming stronger. Every lie he told, every excuse he made me more emotionally distant, and that distance was the first step towards freedom. And it was in this process of silent resistance that the decision was formed. I could no longer live just waiting. The time to act was inevitably approaching. Because, after the internal reaction, the external movement would come. I decided not to scream or argue. My revenge began in silence when I posted an old photo of us with the caption, "Appearances don't always tell the whole story." He laughed nervously, tried to hide it, but I saw in his eyes the fear of losing the image he valued so much. I no longer needed explosive confrontations, because I had all the evidence saved. What he didn't imagine was that every detail he hid would become his own downfall. And I knew, when the mask fell, it wouldn't just be in front of me, but in front of everyone. The first hints began to have an effect. Close friends asked me in private messages if everything was okay. Family members noticed my different silence. His image of perfection began to crack, not because of my voice, but because of the void I left in the air. At work, discreet rumors were already circulating, as he himself left traces. His reputation as a good man was at risk, and I just watched the castle crumble. What was once a secret behind four walls now gained echo, and this scared him more than any direct confrontation. I finally understood that it wasn't about him, but about me. The pain was great, but it gave me back something even greater, the awareness of who I am. She was no longer the deceived woman, she was the woman who survived and chose to start over. I look back and see that every test, every tear, and every silence made me stronger. The trust he destroyed I rebuilt in myself. And I leave a question in the air. If it were you, would you have the courage to face the signs, or would you continue pretending you didn't see them?